We're now going to track this shot. I've already cached the shot up in memory, so let's have a look at Playback so that we can get an idea of what it is that we're going to be doing. Now obviously it's in proxy, so it's going to look a bit soft, but we just wanted to make sure we got good playback. Now we're going to be using the planar tracker to do this shot because it's more suited to tracking large areas that are relatively flat, hence the name planar, so like the forehead here and the chest. Where I'm going to track the forehead to put a scar on for this particular demonstration, but it should be noted that the planar tracker isn't a kind of panacea catch-all kind of tracker. Sometimes it won't work, so you do have to consider other solutions using the other trackers that Fusion has access to. So let's drop back to our main interface. Before we go any further, I'm going to switch to high quality and auto proxy just to make sure the viewport's running in best quality mode so we can see the detail when we track. And the other thing before we go ahead I just want to point out is when you're working with a tool that you've not worked with before, always pop over to the manual. Now this is actually the tool reference manual. You can get this on the main site if you don't have it, because the one that you'll get automatically when you go to the help menu up here is the standard Fusion 9 user manual, but this is an overview manual. The tool manual actually goes into each tool, so for example you can see all the tools listed here, and if we come to the second page and we'll find our tracker tools, there we are, and there's the planar tracker, which is what we're going to use. You can read up on how it works and what it's good for, what it's not good for, stuff like that. So I'd highly recommend when you have the time, if you're going to use this tracker a lot, to have a read up on how it works. I will be just pressing how it works as I go along for the purposes of the demonstration. Right, so let's get ourselves a planar tracker. I'm going to select the dissolve node because what I want is I'm going to add the tracker, and that will automatically connect itself downstream from this node now that I've selected it. Again, control space to bring up the select tool and just type planar. There we are. Don't even finish typing. You can see that it's found it there, and there it is. So I'm going to send this to the main viewer here. So that's now in viewer 1, and I'm also just going to give the viewer a bit more real estate. Since we're tracking, we want to see what we're doing. Now the planar tracker has a number of controls, and the first thing to consider when you are about to start a track is what type of track you want to do. You'll notice up here there is an item called tracker. It's currently by default sets to point, but if you click on the down arrow you'll see there's one called hybrid point area. That basically adds an area tracker to the base tracker. Now it says point tracker, and what's actually happening is the area that you designate to be tracked will be automatically filled with a lot of point trackers. Effectively is what's happening. They're little small tracking areas with their own kind of invisible pattern matching areas, and you can also track with what's called hybrid point area, and the area part is where the entire shape that you've drawn, the interior of the entire shape is considered to be the pattern as well, and it'll do it in addition. So it says there point area, which means it does the points first, and then it'll add to that the area track, which will be the entire inside of the polygon that you draw to be considered one particular texture. Next thing we need to do is we need to find a frame where we are happy to start the track from, because the track won't work until you set your reference time. So for example, if I come up here and I just say let's track forward, we should get an error. There we are. It says track failed, invalid pattern polygon. Make sure you're on the reference frame. You know, even if I'd drawn a polygon, I'm at frame 1 here because I start my timelines from 1 because of some of the other, other bits of software I use that also start at 1 instead of 0. And you'll notice that the reference frame up here is set to 0. So you have to set the reference frame first, choose a reference frame, set it, and then track from that reference frame. So let's do that. I'm going to, now we want to track with probably with the most detail possible, but if we go to the very end of the scene, there we go, scrubs a bit better once it has a chance to cache, you'll see that some of the forehead has already gone off the top of frame. So the question is, where do we start our track from? Well, we can start our track from the halfway point. So luckily for us, 222, halfway is 111, very handy. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create the polygon here, make this my reference frame, then I'm going to track forward and track backwards from that reference frame to get our track solution. So I'm going to start out with the point tracker, see how we do before we bother with anything else. Motion type is listed as perspective. You don't always need perspective. Perspective is when something, for example, if he was turning his head away from us and his forehead was going bleak, then that's when perspective, heavy perspective's happening. That's when you kind of do a perspective track. But if we look at this footage, as you've seen, it's just a push-in. It's not really ever changing perspective in any way. It's literally pushing forward into the shot. Under those circumstances, we don't really need to do a perspective track, because sometimes when you track something like perspective and you don't need to, you'll get a failed track, for example, and you think, well, that's not a lot of good. Well, there's no need to track perspective if there's no perspective to track. I'm actually going to switch this to what's called affine. What that is it means it'll track the shear of the image in addition to scaling and rotation and things like that. And the shearing will give us distortion. So if there's any distortion in the surface, the affine track will give us that distortion. Whereas if we just do translation, rotation and scale, we don't get any distortion. Now in this case, distortion is probably not really much of a concern because he's pretty still and not really doing anything. But if his facial features were changing, like he decided to frown in the middle of the shot, or unfrown maybe, then you would want to have the affine track on, because that distortion would be picked up by the track and become part of it, which can then be transferred into your composited element, which is obviously very important. Right, with all that said, let's get some tracking done. Set reference point, so we're at 111, so I'm going to say 111. And now we've done that, I need to draw a polygon. So you can see we now have a crosshair in on the cursor here. And you don't have to draw a rectangle. You might assume you do, but you don't. I'm going to draw a shape that encompasses as much detail as possible. Catch some of the shadow on this side, but notice I'm also grabbing his eyebrows. There's a load of detail down there that's useful. And I'm now visiting back on the first point to close the polygon, like so. Now after you've drawn like this, you can modify the polygon. Keep in mind you're in add mode, so it's very easy to add extra points you don't want. So if you don't want that, just come over here and switch to modify, the modify mode here, which will let you move the points but without accidentally adding new ones. And that will let you come in here and just sort of make some subtle adjustments after the event. Right, so there we are. We have some interesting detail going on here and up here. And we have enough detail in this forehead area now that when it starts to go off the top of frame here, when we get to the end of the shot, there should be enough detail for it to keep tracking without any issue. We shall see, as they say. There we are. We have our reference point set. We have our polygon drawn out. Let's track forward for the moment. We could track either way, it doesn't really matter, but I'm going to track to end. So there we go. And you can see what the track is doing now. It's generating lots of points inside the polygon area. There There we are. So that's we now got all these green keyframes showing us that it's generated lots of keyframe data. As you can see, the polygon appears to be sticking very, very nicely to his forehead. And now we want to go back the other way, so we want to go back to the beginning. So again, come over here. This is track to start. And again, it's doing the same thing, going back to the beginning of the shot. And there we are. Now, that looks pretty good to me. As we scrub through, you can see that it seems to be sticking very nicely indeed. Now, one thing I'll note here, and for playback, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to switch back to proxy mode. Let's just cache this up, because we can see it better now running in real time with it cached into the proxy mode. And there we go. As you can see, that's pretty rock solid. The polygon is sticking. Now, one thing to note about this, all these little points you're seeing, those are the tracking points. They are transient, and what I mean by that is that Fusion throws those away. If you save the comp and reload it, these points get thrown away. The solution doesn't. The tracking data of the actual polygon is there, because obviously you want that. But all of the tracked points that it used to make that tracking data basically get binned when you save the composition and then reload it. There's a reason for that, and the reason is that to reduce the file size for the Fusion comp, they are basically just binned. So there you go, that's the reason for that. Okay, so there we are. We have our planar track, and now we want to test it by putting something on there initially just to see how good the track is. For that, I'm going to use one of my favorites, which is a UV grid. So let's bring up my folder with my stuff in. So here's my image folder. You'll see I've got this thing called Ash UV grid, which is a grid you can find on the internet very easily if you want to. If you ever do 3D, these are kind of fairly normal. I tend to use it all the time, not just for 3D, but for things like this. So let's just bring this into our flow, minimize that. So there we are, we have a nice grid. And this is what I'm going to stick on the guy's forehead over here. Let's do that. Now, if you come down to the planar tracker, we can see it's got a number of inputs. So let's just bring this back up a bit. If I hover over, you'll see that we have a green input. This says corner pin. This input here says occlusion mask. Now, an occlusion mask is for the tracking process, which we've already done, but it basically means that you can tell the tracker not to track something. So if there is something in the shot, say like a bird or something flew past in front of this guy's face very briefly, therefore it would interfere with the tracking data, then you could actually make an animated mask and feed that in here, which would tell Fusion not to track that item as it went through frame. So that's what the occlusion mask for. And of course we have our standard effects mask, which basically masks the overall output from the planar tracker. So the one we want is this one here, which is corner pin, because what we're going to do is that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to corner pin this grid onto his head, and to do that we need to switch the tracker into corner pin mode. So at the moment, if we look over here on the right hand side, you'll see that it's currently on the track tab, and that's because obviously we've just been generating our tracking data. So you'll also see there's steady, and then there's corner pin, and there's stabilize, and each of these are basically to do particular functions. Steady will actually lock the picture around the point where the tracking data is. So for example, if I switch to steady mode, you can see that it's centered now, and if I scrub the timeline, we crash. It's basically steadying the shot around the tracking point. Corner pin, of course, is what we're about to be using, so I'll pass on that for the moment. And then finally we have stabilize, and what that does is it allows you to fully or partially stabilize the footage if you want to remove the camera motion, things like that. So we're going to choose corner pin because that's what we're about to do. We're about to do a corner pin on this. So I'm just going to do a quick save, Control C, always a very good thing to do every so often. And let's set this up. Now you'll notice that when we select corner pin, we indeed get a object which is our corner pin, but there's nothing in it, and the reason there's nothing in it other than this like polygon that you're looking at or shape is because we haven't attached our UV grid. So we want this grid to be rendered into this area. So we just need to connect it up. So let's do that. Bang, there we go. And here we are. We now have our image data fitted into the corner pin shape. One thing we want to do is we want to be able to see through it a bit to the background. I always like it sort of partially transparent when I'm testing things out. At the moment it's 100% opaque, so let's just come over here and we just want to set our blend down. As you can see, we can blend as much or as little as we want. So I'm just going to drop it down so I can see a bit of the grid but also a bit of the actual data in the background. Right, let's corner pin it. So we're going to come up here and we're going to stick it on his forehead. And this is just purely for us to see if the track is working. That's all it is really. And there we go. And I'm going to zoom in, so I'm just going to pan down, middle mouse button, and then Control scroll wheel. And let's just see if we can get it a bit more like at the right fake perspective angle, because remember this is a cheat, you know, it's not really, we didn't do a perspective track, and even if we did do a perspective track, planar trackers by definition don't generate 3D data, of course. They cheat it. They make 2D data and it looks like 3D data, part of the clever trick of planar tracking, or indeed any form of corner pinning. Okay, so something like that I think will probably do the job, so I'm just going to fit that, and I'm just going to come out of high quality mode, and let's cache this up and see what it looks like. Just do Control C, quick save, and let's let it cache. Okay, so that we don't see the polygon, we can just turn that off temporarily. Now we can see the object sticking very nicely. Now we're getting a bit of what's called aliasing here because of the low proxy mode, so if we go to 100% that doesn't help. So if we want to see this at really better quality, we need to consider either doing running auto proxy if you've got the memory for it, or upping this proxy res. So let's just turn on auto proxy and see if we can cache up the entire sequence at better quality. You can see the improvement in the aliasing already. And again, as I said, this is just, there we are, that's working very nicely. As you can see, it's stuck well and truly to his forehead, which is exactly what we want. So that means that we can go in now and we can put something else where that UV grid is and it will stick. One thing I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to version up. So I'm going to go to the file menu and do a save version. You'll notice that our current file is called v1r1 revision 1. So by doing versioning up in Fusion, it automatically increments the last number, which is the revision, and that now becomes revision 2, which is very handy. So always good to keep a bit of history of the work as you go along. So there we are, now we're done.